Hello everyone and welcome back to Panik Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. It had been hours, maybe more, since I lost my way. The dense fog settled heavily over the forest, its thick veil obscuring every direction. I couldn't tell where the path had gone, and with each step, the world around me felt more alien, more suffocating. My feet were heavy, my body exhausted, yet the oppressive quiet of the woods left me unable to think, to make any rational decision. I had thought about turning back, but every direction seemed the same. The trees, like silent sentinels, loomed over me, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air was damp, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The chill that clung to the mist seemed to sink into my bones, and a creeping dread began to crawl up my spine. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing, as if unseen eyes were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, through the haze, I saw it, a flicker of light, distant yet undeniable. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, a distant star or the reflection of something hidden in the mist. But as I squinted, my heart skipped a beat. It was a lantern, glowing faintly in the distance, swaying gently in the breeze, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance around it. I paused, my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to find another way, to avoid whatever this light was. Yet something, a primal instinct, pushed me forward. Maybe it was my desperation, the gnawing need to escape the oppressive silence of the forest. Or perhaps it was the undeniable pull of that flickering glow, calling to me like a siren song. Without thinking, I started walking toward it, my feet sinking into the soft, wet earth with each step. The light remained distant, teasing me with its proximity, as if daring me to get closer. The closer I got, the more unnatural it seemed, too still, too perfect for this forsaken place. But I told myself it was my only hope, that maybe it would lead me out of this cursed forest. But with every step I took, I felt the pull of something darker, something that warned me I was moving toward danger. Yet, the light called to me, a beacon in the endless sea of fog, offering a chance at escape, or so I thought. As I drew closer, the lantern's glow illuminated a small cottage, hidden away in the depths of the forest. The building was weathered, its wooden walls cracked and decaying, the roof sagging under the weight of years and neglect. The windows were dark, as if the cottage had not seen the sun in decades. It was strange, so strange, how could anyone live out here, in such a place, so far from civilization? Yet, there it was, standing against the backdrop of the fog, its solitary lantern flickering in the distance. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, and I shivered, hugging my arms around my chest. The lantern swung wildly, and just as I feared it would go out, it steadied, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the ground, as if beckoning me toward it. I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward the cottage, drawn by the light, a feeling of urgency building in my chest. As I approached, the door creaked open on its own, the sound low and haunting, like a groan of something old, something ancient. My pulse quickened, and my mind screamed at me to turn around, to flee. But my feet betrayed me. They carried me forward, across the threshold. A figure stood in the doorway. An elderly woman, hunched with age, her pale skin stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, shimmered with something unsettling, something ancient. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of her face, but I could see enough to know that her smile was not one of kindness. "Come in, child," she croaked, her voice thin, like a thread of wind through a broken window. "It's warmer inside." A chill ran down my spine. The air around me grew colder, though the lantern's light seemed to flicker with unnatural warmth. My body froze for a moment, hesitation flooding me. But my legs moved on their own, stepping into the cottage without permission. As my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a violent force, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly, my hand reaching for the handle, but there was no handle. Only smooth, unyielding wood. I stumbled back, my eyes wide with fear, but the old woman's presence was suffocating, her gaze unwavering. "Good," she said softly, as though my compliance had been expected. "You've made the right choice." I stood frozen, the oppressive weight of the room pressing down on me. The air smelled of mildew, of something rotting deep in the walls. There was no warmth here, no safety. The woman stepped closer, her shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. I tried to speak, to ask where I was, what was happening, but no words came. Her smile grew wider, stretching across her face like something unnatural, like a grotesque mask. Her voice, when it came, was low and rasping, like wind whistling through dead trees. "You've entered my domain," she whispered, each word dripping with malice. "You should not have followed the light." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath my feet. The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, twisting in ways that defied logic, as though the very space itself was bending to her will. Suddenly, I realized it was no longer just her voice. The cottage hummed with whispers, faint and distant, as though a chorus of voices long forgotten filled the air. I could not make out their words, but I felt them clawing at my mind, drawing me deeper into the nightmare. "You are lost," the old woman continued, her voice echoing like a chant. "And now, you will never leave." I spun around, my pulse racing. The door that had once been behind me was now gone. There was no window, no exit, only an endless expanse of shadow and decay. The cottage had no boundaries, no way out. Her skeletal hand reached out, touching my cheek with a coldness that burned. I recoiled, but her grip tightened, and I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to move. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling the space around me. "You've crossed the threshold," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "And now you belong to me." I struggled, panic rising within me, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the silence, by the suffocating dark that pressed against me from all sides. My vision blurred as the room seemed to bend and twist, the shadows crawling along the walls, inching closer, tightening around me. In that moment, I realized the horrible truth. The lantern had not been a guide. It had been a lure, drawing me into this prison. The old woman, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of it, part of the curse that bound this place to the forest. And now, there was no way out. I was trapped, like so many before me. A soul lost to the fog, swallowed by the lantern's light. I sank to my knees, my mind spinning, the walls closing in as the air grew impossibly thick. My breath came in desperate gasps, but there was no escape. The room was alive with whispers, the voices of the lost souls who had come before me, now trapped in this cursed place for eternity. I could feel their presence pressing against me, cold and suffocating. Their sorrow, their fear, it mingled with my own, each of us bound by the same invisible chains. The old woman loomed over me, her black eyes now fully visible, gleaming with an unholy light. Her lips parted in a slow, jagged smile. She knelt down to my level, her cold hand brushing my cheek once more, sending a shiver of icy terror through my bones. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. "You should have listened," she whispered, her voice now a chorus of many, as though every soul in the cottage spoke in unison. Once the lantern calls, you belong to it. You belong to me. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her words, wrapping tighter around my body, pulling me into its endless depths. My limbs felt heavy, the world slipping away as if I were sinking into some deep, cold abyss. The edges of the room blurred, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was no longer in control of my own body. My eyes grew heavy, my vision fading, and a deep, bone-chilling cold overtook me. In the distance, I thought I saw the lantern's light flickering again, distant, almost like a dream, but it was no longer calling to me. It was mocking me. I was lost, swallowed whole by the fog and the shadows, a part of the curse that had claimed so many before me. The old woman's face, twisted in that eternal grin, was the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed everything. There would be no escape. And the lantern's light would continue to lure others, one by one, as it had lured me. A beacon of hope to some, a trap to others. A cycle that would never end. I was just another soul trapped in the endless fog, now part of the haunted whispers that would echo for eternity in that forsaken cottage. The evening air hung thick with the promise of something unseen, something ancient. I had always found solace walking along the riverbank at dusk, when the world seemed to slow and the horizon blurred into shades of amber and purple. The soft whispers of the wind were calming, the rhythmic lapping of the water a steady companion to my thoughts. But tonight, something felt different. The usual peace was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed against me like a heavy fog. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on my mind. After all, dusk always had a way of making the world seem a little too large, a little too empty. But then I heard it. The sound was faint at first, so soft it could have been the wind rustling through the trees or a distant bird calling out. But no. It was unmistakable, a woman's sobs, full of grief and despair. At first, I told myself it was just some lost traveler or someone in pain, but as I listened closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The sobs weren't just sorrowful, they were hollow, tinged with something deeper, darker. Curiosity, foolish as it may have been, nudged me forward. The sound was so close now, so real. I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it, even though my feet felt heavier with each step. The cries were desperate, raw, like they had been wrenched from the very depths of the earth. My heart began to race, but I ignored the instinct that told me to turn back. As I walked closer to the water's edge, the air grew colder, the atmosphere thicker, as if the very river was holding its breath. I saw her then, standing at the water's edge. She was tall, draped in a long white gown that flowed like a ghostly mist. Her hair, dark and wild, hung around her face in tangled strands, obscuring her features. But it was her posture that caught my attention. She was bent forward, her back arched with such anguish that it was as though her body was being pulled by the weight of her own sorrow. The sobs that came from her were the sound of a heart breaking over and over again, and it sent a chill deep into my bones. I should have turned around. I should have left, run far from this place. But something inside me, perhaps that same foolish curiosity, pushed me forward, closer to her. I stood at the water's edge, watching her silently weep, torn between sympathy and fear. Her cries echoed over the still water, vibrating in the very air around me. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask if she needed help, but no words came. Something was wrong. My voice felt trapped in my throat, swallowed by the sorrow hanging in the air like a thick fog. I began to take a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get away from this woman and the strange energy surrounding her. But just as I turned to leave, I felt it, the sharp, icy grip of a hand on my shoulder. I froze. My body went numb with terror, and the air around me seemed to freeze in place. The sobs stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart pounding, my breaths shallow and quick. Before I could turn, before I could even react, I felt her breath, cold and damp, on the back of my neck. "Por que me abandonas?" the voice whispered, trembling with such sadness that it shook me to my core. The voice, it wasn't just sorrowful. It was tormented, pleading. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the icy grip tightening around me. "Quien eres?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible against the stillness. The woman's hand slowly slid from my shoulder, and I felt her cold fingers trace the length of my arm, like she was feeling for something, perhaps my soul, perhaps my very essence. Her sobs resumed, louder now, almost deafening, and with each sob, I could feel the sorrow seeping into my very being, pulling me deeper into the darkness. "Mis hijos, where are they?" she whispered again, but this time the words were guttural, desperate. "I have lost them. I am cursed, as you are cursed." A chill swept over me, and my blood ran cold. The words felt like a weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. "I am cursed, as you are cursed," my mind whirled, trying to make sense of it, but it was impossible. Her words made no sense, and yet they did. I turned slowly, my legs heavy, my body stiff. The woman was now standing directly behind me, so close I could feel the cold radiating from her, like a deep frost settling into my skin. Her hair hung loosely in front of her face, but I could see the hollow darkness of her eyes, the emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, I saw it, the look in her eyes. The terror. The madness. "Help me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Help me find them. They were taken from me. You took them from me. You will help me. You will not leave until you do. The words made no sense, but the desperation in her voice sent a shock through my body. I tried to back away, but the river behind me seemed to pull me in, as if the very water was alive, drawing me toward it. The woman's icy fingers brushed my cheek, and I felt something cold and wet streak down my face. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my breath coming in sharp gasps. "No, no," I thought to myself. But her grip was unyielding. Her presence overwhelming. Before I could make another move, the woman's sobs grew louder, more frantic. The river churned beneath my feet, the waters rising with each agonized cry. Her face was now inches from mine, her breath foul and damp against my skin. "You will stay with me now. Forever, she murmured. And in that instant, I knew the truth. La Llorona. The weeping woman. The legend had been real all along, and now I was part of her story. Her grip tightened. Her eyes burned into mine with an intense fury, and then the river reached up, its icy fingers wrapping around my ankles, pulling me deeper into its dark, cold embrace. I tried to scream, but the sound was drowned by the crashing waves, by the hollow cries of a mother who would never stop weeping. The water pulled me under, the darkness swallowing me whole, and as I sank beneath the surface, I felt my own sobs echoing in my chest, no longer my own, but hers. The curse had been passed. And now, I, too, would never leave. The cold water engulfed me, filling my lungs with its bitter, chilling embrace. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body, heavy with dread and despair, refused to move. I tried to scream, but the river swallowed the sound, leaving me with nothing but the oppressive weight of darkness closing in around me. I could still hear her sobs, now coming from all around me, echoing in the murky depths of the river. La Llorona's sorrow filled the very water, entwining itself with my own grief, as if it had become a part of me. It was a sorrow that never ceased, never found relief, a pain that stretched beyond the horizon and into eternity. Her eyes burned into my soul, and I felt her voice crawling into my mind, repeating the same words over and over again, asterisk, you will stay with me now. Forever. Asterisk. The coldness of the river seeped into my bones, until I couldn't tell where the water ended and I began. It was as though I had become part of the river itself, an eternal prisoner, cursed to wander its dark depths forever. I closed my eyes, but her face, pale, hollow, and consumed by her endless sorrow, was always there, haunting me. It was no longer the sound of my own heart beating in my chest. It was hers. Her grief had become my own, and I felt it pulse through me with each passing moment. I had heard the stories, warnings from old women in hushed tones, from frightened villagers who spoke of La Llorona and the terror she brought. But none of them had prepared me for this. None had warned me of the suffocating silence that followed her cries, or the way it tore through you, dragging you into the abyss. I had become another lost soul, another name whispered in fear, another victim of the weeping woman who could never find peace. My body would never surface again. I would never walk along the riverbank at dusk. I would never feel the warmth of the sun on my face again. And in that eternal darkness, I would join her, forever weeping, forever searching, forever lost. It was just another dare, or so I thought. A few friends had thrown out the idea, half in jest, half in challenge, spend the night in the old, abandoned hotel on the outskirts of town. The place had stood empty for years, decaying into the shadows of urban legends. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was cursed. But I didn't believe in any of that. Ghosts were just stories. Curses were just words to spook children. So I decided to go alone, hoping to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid of childish tales. I grabbed my flashlight, packed a bag with only the essentials, and left with nothing more than a sense of excitement and the thrill of being able to say, I've done it. The moment I crossed the threshold, however, the air grew thick. The cold pressed against me like an unseen hand, suffocating and unnatural. I swallowed, my breath visible in the air as I stepped further inside. The lobby was vast, stretching beyond my immediate sight, filled with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper that clung to the walls like old, forgotten skin. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and the once glorious chandelier above me was nothing more than a rusted skeleton. I shook off the uncomfortable feeling settling in my chest. It was just an old building, after all. Nothing more. I could handle this. I glanced around, finding no one else, no signs of life. The silence felt oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The echo of my own footsteps reverberated off the walls, unnervingly loud in the emptiness. A shiver ran down my spine. I dismissed it as nerves, reminding myself I was in control. But the longer I stayed, the more the atmosphere seemed to close in on me. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of me, doors to various rooms lining either side, most of them ajar. I hesitated at each one, half expecting something to leap out, but each room was only more dust, more decay, more emptiness. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something, or someone, was lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I didn't believe in ghosts. But there was something undeniably wrong about the place. It was too still, too quiet. I turned a corner, drawn deeper into the heart of the hotel, and that's when I saw it, a door, slightly ajar, at the end of a darkened corridor. Most of the other rooms had been abandoned, left to ruin, but this one, there was something about it that tugged at my curiosity. Maybe it was the way the light flickered faintly around the edges, as if the room still contained some semblance of life. I knew I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could from this forsaken place. But something, I don't know what, compelled me to push forward. I pressed against the door, pushing it open with a soft creak. The room inside was dimly lit, and I could barely make out the furniture within: broken chairs, a tarnished dresser, and a single thing hanging on the wall, a cracked mirror. The sight of it sent an odd chill through me, though I couldn't say why. It was just a mirror, old, chipped, stained, but it felt wrong, as if it shouldn't have been there. The floor was covered in thick dust, undisturbed for years, the air stale and stagnant. I stepped further into the room, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. I barely noticed my breath becoming shallow, my heart beginning to race. I stared at the mirror. The glass was distorted in places, fractured by time. But there, in the reflection, something was wrong. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. It seemed as though the reflection wasn't quite aligned with the room. The angles didn't match, the light didn't fall the same way. My eyes flicked around the room, trying to make sense of it, and then I saw it. A figure. It was behind me, standing just over my shoulder in the reflection. A vague, indistinct shape, but those eyes. The eyes were hollow, empty holes that seemed to pierce through the mirror, through me. The very air around me seemed to thicken as I stared at them. I felt a coldness creeping up my spine. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. There was no one there. I exhaled sharply, laughing nervously to myself. It's just a reflection. Just a trick of the light. I turned back to the mirror, trying to shake the sudden unease that clung to my skin. But the figure was closer now. The reflection hadn't changed, not in the way I expected. No, it wasn't the figure itself that had moved, it was the eyes. They were nearer. As if it was closing the distance with each breath I took. The hollow eyes, darker, emptier, were staring right at me. My pulse quickened as I took a step back. I couldn't move. It was as though something was holding me in place, keeping me rooted to the spot. My mind screamed at me to look away, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my gaze from those eyes, now so close that I could feel them on the back of my neck. The mirror seemed to draw me in, the reflection becoming more vivid, more real, every second. The figure's shape began to sharpen, its outline clearer. It wasn't just an empty space anymore. There was a presence behind me, a presence I couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of my being. And then, in the reflection, I saw its mouth curl into a smile. The smile was wrong. Too wide. Too sharp. It didn't belong to any human face. I turned quickly, but there was nothing behind me. Nothing. And yet, when I looked back into the mirror, the eyes were closer. And the figure was standing right behind me now, just inches away. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, cold, sharp, and suffocating. The air grew heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Stay with me. The voice came from nowhere, yet it was everywhere at once. It whispered in my ear, filling my mind with the sensation of being touched by invisible fingers. My stomach turned, my body locked in place. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air in the room was too thick, too stifling. I was suffocating under its weight, under its gaze. The figure's hollow eyes filled my vision, and for a brief moment, I thought I could see something moving in them, something ancient, something not quite human. It reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and thin, like claws. It was close enough that I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. The world around me began to blur, the walls stretching, warping as though the hotel itself was bending around me. I tried to turn away, to find the door, but it was as if the room had swallowed me whole. The mirror, the eyes. They were everywhere now. And then I saw it, the figure's reflection, now standing in front of me, smiling that wide, twisted grin. The hollow eyes consumed everything. Stay with me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, trapped in the mirror's grip, but when I finally broke free, the world around me had changed. The hallway was darker. The door I had entered through was gone, replaced by another wall, smooth and featureless. The hotel was no longer the same. And I was no longer alone. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know how I managed to leave the building, but I did. I ran. And I've never gone back. But I can still feel those hollow eyes watching me, following me, no matter where I go. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And the hollow eyes, they follow. I thought I had escaped. I thought leaving the hotel would be the end of it. But I was wrong. It's been days now, maybe even weeks. Time seems to blur, slipping through my fingers like sand. The nightmares started almost immediately. I wake up to the sound of whispering, that same cold voice calling to me from the dark, urging me to stay. I feel the weight of those hollow eyes, pressing down on me even when I'm wide awake. I can't escape them, no matter how far I run. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the stress, just my mind playing tricks after the night in that cursed place. But it's more than that. I know it is. I can see them in mirrors. In windows. In the reflection of every puddle on the street. Their hollow gaze follows me wherever I go. Sometimes, I catch a glimpse of that twisted smile, too wide, too sharp, just out of the corner of my eye. It's always there, lurking, waiting. And the voice, soft but insistent, still whispers to me from the shadows, stay with me. I tried to tell someone. I tried to warn them. But they just look at me like I'm crazy, as if the world hasn't shifted in a way I can't explain. They don't see the way the reflection in the mirror isn't quite right, how it never quite matches the room. How the eyes are always there, just behind me, waiting. I know now what I didn't understand that night. The hotel wasn't just abandoned, it was a doorway. A threshold between this world and something else. And I crossed it. I opened the door. And now, I belong to them. I don't know if I'll ever be free. The hotel may be long gone, buried by time, but the eyes, those hollow eyes, remain. They follow me. They always will. And if you ever wander near that old hotel, don't be surprised if you see something watching you from the shadows. Because once you look into the mirror, once you meet those hollow eyes, they don't let you go. They never let you go. It's strange, the way fear works. It doesn't announce itself like a loud, booming siren. No, it sneaks in, crawling into the corners of your mind when you least expect it. It starts small, like a whisper in the dark, a fleeting thought that's gone as soon as it arrives. But then, it grows, and soon you realize it's not just in your head anymore. It's real. I used to think that stories about the supernatural were just that, stories. Fables people told to get a thrill or to warn others. But that was before I experienced it. It was just an ordinary night. Well, that's what I thought at the time. I had been sitting in my living room, flicking through channels, the kind of quiet evening where the world feels far away. The house was cold, and the faint hum of the fridge was the only sound filling the air. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. But then, there was a knock at the door. Just one knock. Quiet. Soft. I froze, my thumb hovering over the remote. I glanced at the clock. 2:15 a.m. Who in their right mind would be knocking on my door at this hour? My heart pounded faster as the thought settled in. Was it a mistake? A wrong house? Or something worse? I stood up slowly, a dull thud echoing in my chest. Maybe it was someone in distress. Someone lost or needing help. I wasn't about to open the door wide, though. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see a stranger, maybe a tired, disheveled person trying to get a ride or asking for directions. But there were two of them. Children. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe the darkness outside was distorting their features. But no. They were standing there, looking directly at the door, their faces pale as the moonlight, their hair dark and tangled like they had been out there for hours. Their clothes were strange, old-fashioned even, ragged and worn, as though they'd been through something much older than the world I knew. I felt a jolt of unease crawl up my spine, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. It wasn't just the lateness of the hour or the oddness of their appearance. No, it was their eyes. Their eyes were entirely black. Not a single speck of white. Not a pupil, not an iris, just a blackness that seemed to swallow everything around them. I couldn't look away. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to steady myself, but my legs felt like jelly. There was something wrong, something deeply wrong, and I knew it in my bones. The girl spoke first. "Can we come in?" she asked, her voice soft but calm, too calm. Too controlled for someone so young. The words slipped out like a whisper, but they seemed to hang in the air, heavy with something I couldn't put my finger on. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's too late. You should go home." They didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me with those eyes. Blank. Empty. The silence stretched on, far too long. I glanced over my shoulder, a reflex to check if I was still alone. When I turned back to the door, I could see that the boy had shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving me. Another knock. This one louder. More insistent. The sound rattled the doorframe, sending a shockwave through my chest. My pulse spiked, and my hand trembled as it gripped the handle. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I just hide? But my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place. "We're cold," the boy said, his voice just as smooth, just as empty as the girl's. His eyes flickered to the ground before snapping back to mine. "We just want to come inside. It's so cold out here." "No," I said again, the word coming out more forcefully this time. "You need to leave. Now." I stepped back, my hand moving toward the lock, but I didn't take my eyes off them. They didn't react. They didn't flinch or seem upset. They just stood there, still, staring with those black, hollow eyes. The knocking grew louder. Knock. 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 Each strike felt like a physical blow. The sound reverberated through the walls, the floor, the air. I felt it deep inside me. It was as if their knocking was reaching into my soul, pulling me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. "Please," the girl said again, her voice soft but now tinged with something darker, something colder. "Let us in. We won't hurt you if you let us in." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something inside me screamed to close the door, to lock myself away, but I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to their faces, to their eyes, those impossible, endless black eyes. "We'll wait," the boy said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And in that moment, I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain that they weren't asking to come inside. They were demanding it. They weren't going anywhere until I invited them in. The knocking stopped. But the silence that followed was worse. My heart thundered in my chest, and I couldn't seem to find a way to breathe. My mind raced through possibilities, through desperate scenarios of how I could escape this nightmare. But none of it made sense. Why were they here? What did they want from me? I tried to speak again, my voice barely a rasp. "I won't let you in." The girl tilted her head to the side, as if considering my words. Then, she took a step forward. One step, just enough to send a fresh wave of dread crashing over me. The boy followed suit. They didn't move like normal children. Their movements were unnatural, too smooth, too fluid. I wanted to scream, to slam the door, but my body wouldn't listen. The knocking started again, faster, harder, louder. I could hear it from the other side of the door, the walls shaking with the force of their demand. It was no longer just a sound, it was a force, a presence. "We're already here," the boy's voice hissed from the other side, low and cold, echoing in my ears, a sound like a promise, like a warning. My hands shook uncontrollably as I backed away, unable to stop myself. I was trapped. They wouldn't leave until I invited them in. And then, as if they had heard my thoughts, the girl's voice slipped into the air again, but this time it wasn't a request. "You'll invite us in," she whispered, her voice slithering through the cracks in the door like poison. "Or we'll never leave." The weight of her words pressed against my chest, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to flee, but the terror had me pinned to the spot. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I had only one choice now. I looked at the door, my hand frozen above the knob, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that there was no escaping them. They were already inside my head. And they would never leave. I stood there, my body trembling as the knocking continued, now a relentless, thunderous pounding against the door. Each strike felt like it was vibrating through my bones, shaking me from the inside out. I could hear their voices now, low and almost soothing, slithering into my thoughts. "You'll invite us in," the girl's voice whispered again, her words curling around my mind, choking the very will to resist. "It's already too late." I shook my head, the desperation surging through me, trying to push the thoughts away, trying to force myself to think. There has to be a way out. But I knew deep down there wasn't. There was no escape. The door began to splinter under the force of their knocking, the wood creaking and groaning in protest, as if it, too, was succumbing to their power. The walls seemed to close in around me. The house felt smaller, suffocating, the air thick with something I couldn't name, something ancient and dark that hung over everything. With each strike, I felt my resolve slipping away. What would happen if I didn't let them in? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But I could hear the promise in their voices, their threat, and it was worse than any unknown. I had to make a choice. My hand, which had been paralyzed above the door handle, finally fell. I felt my fingers grip the cool metal, and for a moment, I thought I might be able to stop it. But the moment passed. I opened the door. The world went black. The moment the door swung open, the cold rushed in, a biting, suffocating chill that seemed to swallow the entire house. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only hear the soft shuffle of footsteps as they crossed the threshold, the sound of their feet against the floor too loud in the oppressive silence. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. The house was still. Too still. The air was thick with something ancient, something older than time itself. And I knew that I would never escape this. They were here now. In the room. In my head. The girl's voice was a whisper in my ear. "You're ours now." I turned to face them, and they were standing there, watching me with those hollow, endless eyes. Their faces were expressionless, like they had always been part of the shadows, a thing I wasn't supposed to see, a thing that had no business being in the light. And for the first time since they knocked, I felt my body moving, slowly, as if I were no longer in control. I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't even remember why I wanted to. I could feel their cold breath on my skin as they circled me. Their eyes were the last thing I saw before everything went dark. I don't know what happened next. I don't know how long it's been. All I know is that I'm not alone anymore. And I'm not sure I ever will be again. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The kind of night where the world falls silent, where even the wind seems to hold its breath. I had fallen asleep with the soft hum of the fan above me, the rhythmic pulse of the streetlights outside casting a steady glow through my bedroom window. But something had shifted in the air, something I couldn't place. I woke in the middle of the night, disoriented and panicked, as though some unseen force had yanked me from a deep slumber. My heart raced, my mind scrambling to make sense of the oppressive stillness that enveloped the room. There was no breeze, no comforting sounds of the night. Just silence. I tried to steady myself, thinking it was nothing more than a bad dream or the result of too much stress. But when I turned my head toward the window, I saw it. And nothing in this world could have prepared me for what I was about to face. A crimson handprint, bold, as if smeared deliberately, stared back at me from the window. My body stiffened, frozen in place. The faint glow surrounding it made my stomach turn. The red wasn't just red, it was otherworldly, almost alive, pulsing with a sickly intensity. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, some odd reflection or a trick of my tired eyes. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I felt the weight of fear creep over me, sinking into my bones like ice water. The handprint wasn't just on the window, it was a mark, something that shouldn't be there. The kind of mark you don't forget, a reminder of something sinister and unknown. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. My legs were weak, and I stumbled slightly as I made my way to the window, my mind racing. I had to close it. I had to shut out whatever was leaving this horrifying mark. I reached for the window latch, but my fingers were trembling, shaking uncontrollably as they brushed against the cold glass. As soon as my hand touched the window, the handprint shifted. It wasn't just a smear of crimson anymore. The glass chilled under my touch, colder than anything I had ever felt. The handprint began to pulse, no, glow. The red light flickered, brighter and more vivid, as though it had a life of its own. I pulled my hand back instinctively, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, barely more than a breath, but unmistakably there. My name. It was soft at first, just a trace of sound in the stillness of the room. But there it was again, my name star. My body froze. I knew that voice. It's me. The words scraped against my skin like nails on chalkboard. It was him. My brother. The one who had been gone for so many years. He had died when I was just a child, lost in a tragic accident. The memory of that night, of standing in front of his casket, still haunted me. His pale face, lifeless and still, his eyes closed forever. I had never seen him again after that. So how could he be here? whispering my name from the beyond. I stumbled backward, my breathing shallow, panic rising like bile in my throat. I shook my head as if trying to deny it, trying to convince myself this was all a sick dream, a nightmare that would fade away with the dawn. But the more I stared at the window, the more it became clear that this wasn't a dream. The glass was cold now, biting against my fingertips as I reached out again, this time to press the latch shut. But something held me back. The figure outside was not just a shadow anymore. A face was beginning to form. My brother's face, or rather, a twisted, hollow mockery of it. His eyes were black holes, dark and endless. His mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't human, the edges curling unnaturally, as if too wide for his face. The smile was cold, lifeless. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. But it looked like him, sounded like him. A cruel imitation, a distorted memory. The more I stared, the more I realized that this wasn't a ghost, or even something pretending to be my brother. It was something far darker, something that fed off the pain of the living, using familiar faces to manipulate and torment. The figure pressed its hand against the glass harder, the fingers leaving streaks of frost in their wake, as if it was pressing through the very fabric of the world itself. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat, panic threatening to overwhelm me. The whisper came again, louder now. Asterisk, you left me, alone. Asterisk. The voice seemed to drip with bitterness, with accusation. It echoed in my skull, rattling the walls of my mind, filling the room with an eerie, suffocating weight. My brother had never spoken like this, never sounded so vengeful. The glass grew colder with each passing second. I could see my own breath now, misting in front of me as the temperature dropped. The figure's hand remained pressed against the window, and with each breath I took, it felt as though the world was closing in on me, suffocating me in a fog of dread. I took a step back, my mind spinning, my limbs frozen in place. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, as though the very air had thickened, turning to concrete. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. I couldn't escape this thing that wore my brother's face, this thing that claimed to be him. The longer I looked at it, the more distorted its form became. Its edges blurred and flickered like a broken television screen. It wasn't just outside the window anymore, it was in the room with me, crawling through the very walls. Asterisk, you left me alone. I died alone. Now you will, too, asterisk. The voice was almost a chant now, a cruel mantra. My skin crawled with every syllable, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too much. The room felt smaller, tighter, the air thick with an unseen force. I ran. I don't remember how I moved, but suddenly, my legs were carrying me, darting through the hallway, stumbling into the living room, crashing into the furniture as I tried to escape. I could hear the whispering following me, growing louder, more insistent with every step. Asterisk, you left me. You'll never escape me, asterisk. I reached the door, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, but I hadn't locked it. I pulled, screamed, but nothing worked. I was trapped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. My brother's face flashed in my memory, twisted and broken, his hollow eyes burning with accusation. The whisper came again, soft but piercing, I'm still here. I turned to the window. The crimson handprint still glowed, brighter than ever, its fingers now pressed hard against the glass. The figure on the other side stood still, its grin widening impossibly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. And I realized, too late, that I was never going to escape. The hand began to move again, pressing against the glass with an unnatural force, and I could hear its voice, louder, stronger, filling the room. Asterisk, it's time to join me. Asterisk. The darkness closed in. I felt the cold seep deeper into my bones, every breath I took now visible in the icy air that surrounded me. My heart hammered against my chest as the walls seemed to close in, pressing tighter, suffocating me. The handprint on the window glowed fiercely, as if it was drawing me in, pulling me toward it with an almost magnetic force. The figure outside, it wasn't just a ghost, a memory. It was something else. Something dark and hungry, waiting to claim me. I struggled, my hands shaking as I clawed at the door, desperate for any way out, but there was nothing. The whispers had turned into a roar in my ears, the voice of my brother twisted into a sinister chant, each word seeping into my mind like poison. Asterisk, you left me alone. Now you'll be alone forever. Asterisk. I could no longer distinguish where my fear ended and reality began. The air was thick with shadows, the room spinning as my eyes darted from one corner to another. There was no escape. The hand on the glass continued to press harder, as though it were trying to shatter the barrier between the world of the living and the dead. The glass began to crack. A spiderweb of fractures spread from the edges of the handprint, the sound like nails scraping across a blackboard. My breath caught in my throat as the cracks grew wider, as if the very fabric of the room were unraveling, and I, the foolish soul who dared defy the dead, was about to be consumed by it. I fell to my knees, my mind racing through memories, trying to recall anything that might save me, but all I could think of was him. My brother. His face, distorted now, his hollow eyes, his twisted smile. He had come for me, and there was no mercy. I reached for my phone, my hands slick with sweat, but the screen was cracked. The signal was gone. There was no one. It was just me and the thing outside, the thing that claimed my brother's face and had no intention of letting me go. The crack in the glass grew larger. The figure's grin stretched wider, the eyes now fully black, swallowing all light around them. And then, with one final, deafening crack, the window shattered. The cold hit me like a tidal wave. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the swirling darkness that rushed in. The last thing I saw before I was swallowed whole by the shadows was the crimson hand, now more solid than ever, reaching through the broken glass, fingers grasping, pulling me into the night. You're mine now, it whispered. Asterisk, forever. Asterisk. And then, everything went dark. They found the house empty the next morning, the window shattered, the room in complete disarray. No trace of me remained. The police were baffled. The only thing they found was a faint, glowing red handprint on the glass, a mark that would never fade. The whispers never stopped. And they never will. I had always been drawn to the quiet charm of small English villages, their timeless beauty and serene atmosphere offering the perfect escape from the rush of modern life. So when I found a century-old bed and breakfast tucked away in a remote corner of the countryside, I thought I had stumbled upon the ideal retreat. The house was a picture of rustic elegance, ivy crawled up the walls, the scent of fresh-baked bread lingered in the air, and the low murmur of a stream flowing nearby added to the peaceful ambience. The owners, a lovely elderly couple named Mr. and Mrs. Halloway, greeted me with warmth and hospitality that immediately put me at ease. The couple made small talk over a pot of tea and told me about the history of the place. The house was built in the early 1800s, and it had been passed down through generations. It was clear they had a deep attachment to the building, and their pride in maintaining it was apparent. I found it all quite charming and, as I settled into my room, I felt a sense of comfort, lulled by the peaceful sounds of the village outside. But that peace was short-lived. At first, I noticed only faint sounds, creaks in the floorboards above me, a soft rustling, as if the house itself was shifting and groaning in the night. I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just the old house settling. However, as the days passed, the noises grew more distinct. At night, I would hear what sounded like footsteps pacing overhead, slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking back and forth in the attic. The thought of rats or birds in the walls crossed my mind, but there was something unnerving about the rhythm of those steps. They didn't feel random. They felt purposeful. Then came the whispers. It started with a soft murmur, almost too faint to be sure if I was hearing it at all. It was a voice, barely audible, as if someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The voice seemed to drift through the walls, just out of reach, teasing my senses. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was my imagination playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. One night, after a long, restless day of exploring the nearby countryside, I lay in bed, eyes wide open, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft, lilting hum. A lullaby. The melody was haunting, familiar yet distant, like a forgotten memory. I froze. The sound seemed to come from above me, from the attic. It was so clear, so precise, that for a moment I thought I was imagining things. But as the humming continued, I knew it was real. It was a child's voice, sweet yet eerily melancholic. I could almost hear the words, though they remained just out of reach. What unsettled me more than the lullaby was the sheer silence that followed. No footsteps. No creaks. Just the hum, steady and unnerving, filling the stillness of the night. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Driven by an inexplicable pull, I rose from the bed, my heart racing, my body trembling with both fear and curiosity. I knew I shouldn't go up there, not at this hour, not with that strange humming still echoing in my ears. But something compelled me, urging me to discover its source. I pulled on my coat and made my way to the door. The house felt colder now, and as I ascended the narrow staircase leading to the attic, the air grew heavier, thick with the smell of dust and age. The steps creaked beneath my weight, but it felt like the house was holding its breath, as if waiting for me to reach the top. The attic door was old, weathered, and dark. It seemed to blend into the shadows of the narrow hallway. My hand hovered over the knob, cold to the touch. I hesitated, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, as if the house itself had whispered a command, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The temperature dropped sharply as I stepped inside, the chill biting into my skin. The room was vast, its corners swallowed in darkness. I could barely make out the shapes of old furniture draped in dust sheets, forgotten relics of a time long past. The faint glow of the moon outside filtered through a small window, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch across the room. And then I heard it again. The lullaby. Louder now, clearer. It was as if the child's voice was right in front of me, singing directly into my ear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a shiver ran down my spine. I stepped forward, the wooden floorboards creaking under my feet. That was when the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The room was now shrouded in darkness, the shadows twisting unnaturally around me. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the house itself was holding me prisoner. Panic set in. My breath quickened, each exhale a visible cloud in the frigid air. And then, from the far corner of the room, I saw her. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, standing motionless in the shadows. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her face was obscured, as though she were hiding. I couldn't see her eyes, but I felt them on me, cold and empty. Her presence filled the room like a suffocating fog. The lullaby stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in on me. I wanted to speak, to ask her what she was doing here, but my throat was dry, my voice caught in my chest. And then, without warning, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped toward me, her footsteps unnervingly quiet on the dusty floor. I could feel the weight of her gaze, even though I couldn't see her eyes. She was too close now, too close. The cold radiating off her was unbearable, like the chill of death itself. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice sharp and brittle, like ice scraping against stone. I staggered backward, panic surging through my veins. What do you want?" She tilted her head, the faintest of smiles curling on her lips. "You're here now," she said, her voice almost a giggle. "And now you'll stay. Forever." I reached for the door, but the shadows seemed to stretch, swallowing it whole. There was no escape. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls constricted, the floor buckled beneath my feet. The humming returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that filled the room, their whispers melding into one horrific song. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of her hollow gaze. "Please," I begged, my voice trembling. "Let me go." The little girl's smile widened. "You'll never leave," she said, her voice now a low, guttural growl, her face distorting in the shadows. "Not until you join us." And then the darkness closed in, suffocating me, drowning out the last of my breath. The next morning, when the Halloways came to check on me, they found the room empty. The door to the attic was wide open, but there was no sign of me anywhere. No trace, no clue. They said nothing was unusual, but the air in the house had changed. There was a tension, an oppressive weight that lingered in the corners of the rooms. And from that day on, no one ever stayed in room 7 again. The house remained quiet, too quiet. Years passed, and the bed and breakfast remained, though it never quite held the same charm for the locals. People still came to stay, passing through the quiet village, but few ever returned. Whispers began to spread, strange rumors that no one could quite explain. Guests who stayed in room 7 would often leave early, claiming to have felt uneasy, or worse, never speak of their stay again. The Halloways, who once tended to the bed and breakfast with such care, gradually grew reclusive. Mrs. Halloway's hair turned silver, her face etched with worry, and Mr. Halloway's eyes lost their usual warmth, replaced by a distant, haunted look. They began to avoid certain parts of the house, especially the attic. One winter, the bed and breakfast closed without notice. The shutters were drawn, the gates locked. When curious townsfolk ventured by, they found the once beautiful house abandoned, the ivy creeping further into the cracks in the walls, swallowing it in a green embrace. Some say the Halloways simply disappeared, leaving behind only the house that had once been their life. But for those who dared to wander too close, the house still stood as a silent, chilling monument to a forgotten horror. I couldn't shake the feeling, the sense that the house was waiting for another lost soul, another curious traveler, someone like me. There are stories, whispered among the villagers, that the little girl still roams the attic, her hollow eyes watching for anyone foolish enough to make the climb. They say she hums her lullaby, softer now, almost as if coaxing you to listen, to follow. I wish I could forget. I wish I could erase the images of that night, the girl's hollow smile, the darkness that closed in around me, the cold that settled in my bones. But the truth is, I'll never escape it. I will always hear that lullaby, always feel her cold, empty gaze on me, even as I try to move on. And somewhere, in the depths of my nightmares, I know that I'll never truly leave that room. Not until I join them. It was supposed to be a simple journey, just a few hours on the road, the kind of travel I'd done 100 times before. The rain had started off mild, nothing more than a drizzle, but soon the storm began to build in strength, as if nature itself had been possessed by something darker. The wind howled through the trees, bending them like tortured souls, and the rain fell in relentless sheets. The road stretched endlessly before me, the trees on either side a blur of shadowy shapes in the downpour. The chill crept into my bones, and I realized I had no choice but to find shelter soon. As I trudged along, I spotted it, a small, weathered inn, nestled between two towering trees. Its lights flickered like a weak pulse against the storm. The sign above the door swayed on its rusted hinges, creaking mournfully as though it, too, was struggling to remain. It stood there in the dark, ancient and alone, its silhouette distorted by the swirling rain. I had no choice but to approach. I stepped inside, shaking the rain from my coat. The warmth of the hearth greeted me like an old friend, but there was something wrong. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something older. The hearth crackled and spat as a fire lazily burned in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the uneven walls. The innkeeper was a thin, hunched man, his face hidden beneath a frayed hood. His eyes, though, were the first thing that caught my attention. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Hollow. Haunted. He didn't speak at first. His gaze flickered toward the storm outside, and his fingers, resting on the edge of the counter, twitched as though he were listening to something far off. Then, with a voice that seemed far too quiet for the room, he murmured, "You're not the first." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could ask him what he meant, he added, "And you won't be the last." I felt a strange shiver snake down my spine, but I tried to dismiss it. It was just the storm, I told myself. The innkeeper was just a superstitious old man. But even as I thought this, something in the air shifted. The wind outside howled louder, the rain turning into a near torrential downpour, and the uneasy feeling deepened in my chest. The innkeeper turned away, shuffling toward the back of the room with a soft, shuffling gait, as though he were reluctant to leave. I moved to the fireplace, trying to chase away the chill from my bones. The fire crackled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around me were closing in. There was a restlessness in the air, a suffocating pressure that made it impossible to relax. I glanced around the room, but it seemed far too quiet, as though I were the last living soul for miles. Just as I began to turn toward the stairs, the ground suddenly shook beneath me. A loud crash, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy hitting the inn's walls. My heart jolted in my chest, and I spun toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. A low rumble echoed from beyond, and then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of galloping hooves. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the storm, some cruel illusion created by the thunder and rain. But the noise grew louder, closer, unmistakable. The wind picked up, bending the trees outside, and the hooves began to pound the earth with rhythmic precision. I felt a tightness in my chest as the innkeeper's warning echoed in my ears, "Asterisk, you're not the first." Asterisk. I rushed to the door, throwing it open against the storm. The rain slapped against my face, the wind fierce enough to nearly knock me off my feet. I squinted into the darkness, my eyes straining to make sense of the shadows. And then I saw it. A tall figure, cloaked in black, sat upon a horse. The storm seemed to part for him, the lightning flashing around his silhouette, illuminating his presence like some terrible omen. The horse's coat was slick and dark, its mane flying wild in the wind. But it wasn't the horse that froze my blood. It was the rider. He was headless. The neck of his cloak billowed behind him, but where his head should have been, there was only emptiness, an empty, gaping void. The storm howled, but the figure moved with a slow, unnatural grace, as if the wind itself parted for him. His body was tall and unnaturally stiff, like a ghost or a puppet controlled by invisible strings. His horse drew closer. The hooves struck the earth with a slow, methodical rhythm, and my heart began to race. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. But I could feel his presence, his gaze, his eyes, hitting me with an unearthly weight. His gaze was hollow, lifeless. And yet it pierced through me. My throat went dry, and I took a step back, but my legs wouldn't obey me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something far worse than the storm itself. The headless rider wasn't just passing by. No, he was waiting for me. And his horse stood still, as if waiting for me to climb onto its back. I felt a sudden, deep, inexplicable fear that gripped me to my very core. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. I felt like a puppet, helpless against whatever dark force had brought this rider here. My mind screamed for me to turn and flee, but my feet wouldn't obey. The wind carried a chilling whisper, a voice that wasn't a voice at all. Run. But I couldn't. I stood paralyzed, my eyes locked on the hollow figure, knowing what was coming next. The horse's hooves echoed like the beating of a drum in my chest, and then, slowly, the rider moved his arm, an unnatural, deliberate motion, reaching down toward the reins. The horse's head tilted toward me, its wild eyes fixed on mine. My body felt cold, as if the very essence of my being was being drawn out into the storm. I don't know how long I stood there, motionless, trapped in the gaze of that headless specter. The wind whispered again, the trees trembling as though in fear. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the rider turned his horse, his hollow gaze never leaving me. The hooves echoed in the storm, fading into the distance, but I knew, it wasn't over. The rider was still out there. And he was waiting for me. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut behind me with a trembling hand. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing. The storm raged outside, but I didn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was the rhythm of those hooves, the slow, relentless thundering that followed me, that would never stop. It was then that I realized, the storm had brought him here. The headless horseman wasn't just a story. He was a presence, a rider from beyond the grave, searching for his next victim. And now I was marked. My heart thundered in my chest as I stood in the silent, suffocating dark, the only sound a faint, distant galloping of hooves. He was coming for me. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last, as I sat in that cramped, dimly lit-in room. The storm outside raged with unrelenting fury, but the wind no longer held my attention. No, my thoughts were consumed by the echo of those hooves, the haunting reminder that I was no longer just a traveler caught in a storm. I was a prey, marked by the rider, the one who would not let me go. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even close my eyes without seeing that hollow gaze, feeling the cold fingers of terror claw at my chest. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, like the very walls of the inn had become part of his trap. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind, felt like a warning, a promise that the rider was still out there. Waiting. Just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds, I thought I heard something, a faint scratching at the door. My breath caught in my throat. Could it be? The storm had abated, but I didn't trust the silence. I forced myself to my feet, heart pounding. The innkeeper's words flashed through my mind. Asterisk, you're not the first. And you won't be the last. Asterisk, his cryptic warning had never felt more real than it did now. Slowly, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I had no plan, no idea what to do. My mind raced through every possible escape, but nothing made sense. There was no way out. No safe place. The headless rider had come for me, and there was no running from him. With a deep breath, I yanked the door open, expecting to see the rider standing there, his headless figure towering above me. But there was nothing. Only the quiet aftermath of the storm, the trees swaying gently in the wind. My heart sank with a mixture of confusion and dread. Had I imagined it all? Was it a trick of the storm? But as I stepped outside, a chill swept over me, and I froze. The horse. His horse. It stood in the clearing just beyond the inn, its coat still damp from the rain. Its eyes were locked on me, wild and feral, as though it had been waiting for me all night. And standing beside it, just out of sight from the inn's doorway, was the rider. His absence of a head seemed even more pronounced in the early light, a grotesque mockery of a man. He was still. Motionless. Watching. A shiver ran through me, a coldness so deep it felt as if the very air had turned to ice. My blood turned to stone in my veins as I realized the terrible truth. He wasn't just a ghost of the storm. He was an eternal hunter, and he would not leave until he had claimed what was his. The air around me thickened, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath my feet, as if it, too, was bound by some ancient curse. I could hear the faintest echo of galloping hooves in the distance, drawing closer. I turned to run, but the storm had returned. In the span of a heartbeat, the sky darkened, the wind howling once again, pushing me back. The trees bent in unnatural directions, as if the world itself was conspiring against me. The hooves thundered, louder now, and I knew I was no longer safe. The rider was closing in. I ran, my breath ragged, my legs burning with exhaustion, but no matter how fast I moved, the sound of those hooves only grew louder, the rhythm of death pursuing me relentlessly. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if I were being dragged toward him, toward the fate I could not escape. And then, in an instant, the hooves stopped. I dared to look over my shoulder, and there he was, the rider. He sat tall on his steed, his hollow gaze locked onto me as the world around us seemed to freeze. I could hear nothing but the storm in my ears and the pounding of my own heart. With one final, deliberate motion, the headless horseman raised his arm toward me, the reins in his hand slackening. The horse's body tensed, ready to strike. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. The rider had not come to chase me, to play with me. He had come to take me. And now, there would be no escape. I tried to scream, but my voice was stolen by the wind. The earth seemed to rise up beneath my feet, and I fell, into the abyss that lay ahead. And then, as if the storm had swallowed me whole, there was nothing. Only the hooves. Forever drawing closer. I had always been the type of person who believed in logic. Rational explanations, practical solutions. When I moved into my new apartment, I told myself that any strange noises or shadows were just my imagination adjusting to a new place. After all, it was an old building, and I knew from the moment I stepped in that it had its quirks. The walls creaked, the pipes groaned, and there were drafts that made the windows rattle. Nothing that couldn't be explained away. But the longer I stayed, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. I chalked it up to the stress of the move, the loneliness of living alone in a city that felt far too large. It was just a rough patch, I thought. Just my nerves. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were subtle, soft, almost inaudible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls, or maybe the space between the floors. I told myself it was the building settling. But soon, they grew louder, clearer, as if someone was speaking just outside my door. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was the wind or the neighbors. But the whispers weren't random. They were deliberate. Sometimes, I could make out words in the hiss of the air, words I couldn't quite understand, but that sent chills down my spine. Then objects began to move. Small things, books on the shelf out of place, the refrigerator door ajar when I knew I had closed it. At night, I'd wake to the sound of shuffling footsteps or a faint, rustling sound coming from the dark corners of the room. It felt as though someone, was just out of sight, watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just the apartment settling, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. One evening, after returning home from a long day at work, I found the apartment colder than usual. I dismissed it, thinking maybe the heating system was malfunctioning. But when I turned on the lights, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, somehow deeper, than I remembered. I shrugged it off as my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the sense of unease gnawing at me. Then, at around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft rustling noise coming from the far side of the room, near the window. I froze, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, as though something, or someone, was moving around in the dark. I held my breath, my eyes scanning the room, trying to see through the dim light. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft and slow, echoed through the apartment. I wanted to call out, to turn on the lights, but my body wouldn't move. My mind screamed for me to get up, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed. The footsteps came closer, closer to my bed, until I could feel the weight of something heavy in the air, pressing down on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, it would all be gone. But when I opened my eyes again, I saw it. At the foot of my bed stood a figure, tall and unnaturally thin. Its silhouette was obscured by the darkness, but I could see its long, black hair cascading down like a curtain, obscuring its face. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it were waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge its presence. I could feel the weight of its stare, even though I couldn't see its eyes. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick and heavy, as though the very space was holding its breath. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey me. It was as if I were trapped in a nightmare, one that I couldn't escape. I wanted to look away, to pretend that the figure wasn't there, but my gaze was locked onto it, as if drawn by some invisible force. I thought I was imagining things, that I was still dreaming, but the coldness in the room, the sense of dread that washed over me, was too real to be a dream. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to whisper, barely able to choke out the words, "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond at first. It stood there, motionless, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but my mouth was dry, my throat tight. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the bed, unable to tear my gaze away. Then, it leaned forward, ever so slowly, until its face, if it even had one, was just inches from mine. I could smell something faint, like decaying flowers, and the coldness of its presence sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't dare breathe. And then, the voice came. It wasn't the voice of the figure. It was deep, hollow, and distant, like a whisper that echoed from somewhere far beyond. The voice was not its own, but it was unmistakably there, surrounding me, invading my mind. "You should never have come here." The words, cold and venomous, froze me in place. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching farther, consuming the light. I felt a sharp, sickening chill crawl across my skin, like ice creeping through my veins. The figure didn't move, but the air around me felt heavy, as if the weight of the words pressed against my chest. My body trembled, and I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The terror that gripped me was suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The voice was still ringing in my ears, echoing over and over, "You should never have come here." I wanted to close my eyes, to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my gaze from the shadowy figure at the foot of my bed. It was as though I was trapped in a web, bound by something far more powerful than anything I could comprehend. I felt like I was going to drown in the darkness, consumed by whatever was standing in front of me. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. The air seemed to snap back to normal, the room no longer heavy with that oppressive energy. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It felt wrong. Empty. Like something was missing. I didn't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, but when I finally managed to move, I rushed to turn on every light in the apartment. I checked every corner, every room, but it was empty. Silent. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare. A hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. That thing, whatever it was, had been real. And it wasn't gone. It was still waiting, lurking in the shadows of the apartment, biding its time. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind, sent me into a panic. The words echoed in my mind, "You should never have come here." I don't know how much longer I can stay in this apartment. But I know this much for certain, the figure is still here. It's still waiting. And I don't think it will ever let me leave. Days have passed since that night, but the terror hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown stronger. The whispers are more frequent now, as if the walls themselves are speaking to me, beckoning me closer to something I don't understand. The figure has never returned, at least, not in the same form, but I feel its presence, always lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, like a shadow that never quite leaves. I've tried to leave. I've packed my things, considered running far away from this place, but something always holds me back. Each time I stand at the door, ready to walk away, my feet freeze. The thought of leaving only fills me with dread, as if there's a part of me that knows I'll never escape. And then, there are the dreams. Every night, they become more vivid, more real. In my sleep, I see the figure, taller now, its hair longer, darker, waiting at the foot of my bed, watching me. The whispers are louder in my dreams, as if they're warning me, telling me I'm not supposed to be here. But I don't know how to leave. I don't know where to go. The worst part? I can't shake the feeling that it's already too late. That the figure has already claimed me, and no matter how far I run, I'll never be free. I can feel it, just behind me, every moment of every day. That constant, suffocating weight, waiting for me to turn around, to acknowledge it. Waiting for me to say the words that will make it real. You should never have come here. And now, I understand. I understand what it meant. This place wasn't meant for me. It was never meant for anyone. And once you've set foot here, once you've seen the shadow, there's no going back. I'm trapped. I don't know how much longer I have before it comes for me again. But when it does, I won't be able to run. The shadow at the foot of the bed will always be there, waiting. It's only a matter of time before it finally claims me, just like it claimed this apartment, this city, and everything else that came before. And now, as I sit here in the darkness, I realize something else. It's not just the apartment that's haunted. It's me.